All right, Jeannie, it is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Hillary, and good evening, everybody. Tonight's program involves two women. One, Edith Mayer Cord, who was born in 1928 in Austria and was trapped in Europe during World War II. Edith's father and brother were arrested in France and deported to Auschwitz and murdered. Edith and her mother hid in France and survived. Edith later graduated from the University of Toulouse in France before eventually coming to the United States. She was a university professor and a financial advisor and ultimately wrote her memoir. The second woman is with us tonight. She is Edith's daughter. Her name is Emily DuThinh. Emily is a geologist, environmental consultant, and an adjunct professor at the University of Detroit. Emily will be talking to us about her mother's legacy and how it has impacted her life and how it is impacting Michigan. This is a family history involving World War II, the Holocaust, circuitous journeys, and a Michigan woman who ties it all together. I'm excited to hear this story. We will be able to ask her questions at the conclusion of her remarks. So a JHSM welcome, Emily DuThinh.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to share my mother's story. I think she struck a very good balance when I was growing up between talking about her traumatic childhood and not dwelling on it. A lot of Holocaust survivors go to one extreme or the other. They either can't stop talking about it or they never say a word about it. And I think she struck a good balance. When I was very little, I felt like she was, when I was in preschool, it was an exciting story of how she was hiding from the bad guys. And then when I got into elementary school, I realized this was not simply an excitement of hiding from bad guys. It was a lot more than that. And by high school, I read everything I could find about it. My mother did a lot of research while writing her book, and I'm going to screen share. So let's see, I need to, here we go. If I share the screen. It should go on to slideshow mode.
It's there.
Is it in slideshow mode?
Yeah, we're seeing something. Yes, we're seeing slides.
Okay, here we go. So that's a picture of my mother. And that is her book on the corner on my screen. It's hidden partially by the videos of all of us speakers, but hopefully you can see it. And this is her book. This is what's hiding behind the videos there. She did a lot of research while she was writing her book. And then she passed away on September 21st, 2021. So I feel a need to pick up her torch. She did a lot of public speaking about the Holocaust and her story, and about the origins of Nazism. So I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about how genocide is not something in ancient history. It starts with words, and silence is complicity. So we need to talk about it. So a little bit about my mother. She was born in 1928 in Vienna, Austria. That's the capital of Austria, a fairly urban, nice city. I was fortunate enough to be able to go there with her towards the end of her life and see the city. She was my tour guide. Vienna is located between Germany and Italy, and this will become important later in this talk. Her family was fairly assimilated. She went to public school for preschool through third grade in Vienna. The Depression hit the worldwide, and it impacted her childhood in Vienna as well. In the middle there is a picture of her father. He sold used clothing and was having a hard time making a living during the Great Depression. So on the bottom, There is a picture of my grandfather. He is holding my mother as a baby, and his arm is around my mother's brother, Kurt. Behind, I don't know if you can see it, behind the videos is a picture of my mother and my grandmother. I don't know if I can move that.
We're seeing it
There we go.
just fine.
All right, are you able to see the picture?
Yeah,
of
we're seeing everything. No
Okay.
problem.
Excellent. And then on the left-hand side, there's a picture of Kurt. This was his bar mitzvah day. That was 1939. He was in his bar mitzvah suit, very beaming with pride at his bar mitzvah. Very importantly, he got a camera for his bar mitzvah. That was his bar mitzvah gift. And many of the photos in this presentation were taken by Kurt and with his camera. On his bar mitzvah day, he took a picture of my mother. That's the little girl standing in front of the big building in a coat that's too big for her. She was 8 years old in that picture. And then she's 9 years old in the picture with her mother. That was in 1937, shortly before they moved to Italy. So because her father was having a very hard time earning a living in Vienna, he went to Genoa, Italy to see if he could find some better business opportunities. And he did find a better job there. So in 1937, when my mother was 9 years old, they moved to Genoa. Austria borders Italy, and so it was a move across the Alps into a little bit south. They had been watching the rise of Nazism in Germany with great concern. They were watching the anti-Semitism in the papers in Germany. They were watching the establishment of concentration camps for political prisoners. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws in Germany deprived Germany's Jews of basic human rights. So they could see the writing on the wall, and when they got out of Vienna, 6 months later, Hitler marched into Vienna and annexed Austria. They were patting themselves on the back saying, wow, we really escaped the Nazism by moving to Italy. We were prescient. So this year in Genoa was, my mother would always say this was the best year of her childhood. She went to a Jewish day school there. She made lots of friends. She loved the climate. She loved the food. She really had an excellent year in Genoa, although she had to repeat 3rd grade because she needed to learn Italian. But then in July 1938, Mussolini, the leader of Italy, formed the Axis, the agreement with Germany and later with Japan. And that is when the persecutions began in Italy. Her father and brother both lost their jobs. Her brother had been working as an assistant at a clothing store. Jewish children couldn't go to school with non-Jewish children. So she wasn't able to go to school. The Jewish day school that she was in was closed. The Italian school went to class in the morning, and the Jewish students went to school in the afternoon. And my mother would say, we were taught nothing. She learned to sing fascist songs. She learned about fascism. She learned a lot of propaganda about from the fascist propaganda, but they didn't teach them anything of value. They lost their apartment. She says, she describes how she was learning geography at the kitchen table, poring over a world map as they were applying for visas to countries around the world, including the United States, which did not give them visas, refused to allow them to come. So this paper on this slide is the household census of Jews. You can see the first line is my grandfather, the second line is my grandmother, the third line is Kurt, my mother's brother, and the fourth line is Edith, my mother. Again, this is the first, or some of the early steps in genocide. It does not start with gas chambers. It starts by dividing people into us and them, forcing them to identify themselves with the symbol. In this case, you'll see in the census that Mayor Shmuel Judah, he had to add the name Judah to his name. They were all identified as Jews. And this leads to systematic discrimination and dehumanization. So they couldn't stay in Italy any longer. They decided to go to France, figuring they would escape Nazism and the countries under Germany and Italian axis. The map of Europe changed constantly during the war. And I'm not going to drown you with maps. This is the only map I'm going to show you. So this is a map that shows the front or the Italy and Europe during 1941 to 1942. I'm actually talking at the moment about the day they crossed into France, which was April 23rd, 1939. So at that time, the dark blue areas, Germany, Austria, and Italy, was the axis. That was a portion of Europe under Nazism. The rest of Europe, including the parts that are light blue, at the time they crossed, were still independent countries. They ended up going from Genoa, which is in the back of the Italian boot, over to a city called Ventimiglia on the French border. And my mother writes in her book on a Saturday morning, the Italian station master told us that the next day there would be no passport control at the French border because his counterpart had the next day off, Sunday. So my parents immediately shipped our meager belongings to Nice and prepared us for the crossing. Mama made me put on a little apron over my summer dress. She was thinking of a dirndl, the traditional outfit popular in Austria. She thought that would make our family look more casual, when in fact it identified us as foreigners. In her ignorance, she did not know that in a Mediterranean country, only cooks and housewives wore aprons. We took the bus to Nice. First, they got on a train, crossed over into France, and then took the bus to Nice. And my mother goes on in her book, Papa asked the conductor for 4 tickets to Nice in his broken French. The conductor hesitated and looked us over one at a time. I was scared, for even I could tell that he knew we were illegals. Our lives were in his hands. Would he hand us over to the police or would he let us in? After what seemed like a long time, he handed us the tickets without saying a word and left abruptly. I heaved a sigh of relief. For the moment, we were safe. So they were able to go into Nice that way, which is a city right on the Italian border. I do want to point out briefly, since I'm not going to show any more maps, there's a little arrow pointing to a hook of Switzerland that sticks into France. We're going to come back to that hook later in the presentation. So these are pictures of my mother's family in Nice. They were helped by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Now remember, at this point, they had German passports. They were citizens of Austria. Austria is now part of Germany. So they were Germans, classified as German citizens at this point, even though they had never set foot in Germany. So they tried to get legal status. Following the rules was extremely important to my grandfather. He always, from the time in Vienna, was very anxious to follow the rules and keep everything legal. So they tried to get legal status in France. They were legally refugees, German refugees. They were applying for political asylum. There's a picture on the left of my uncle Kurt at the age of 16. He got a job working for the Joint Distribution Committee as a messenger. And my mother says he was very happy with that job because he could travel around and he got a bicycle with that job. So that gave him, at the age of 16, some independence. My grandparents took in laundry and sewing for wealthier refugees. You can see the picture of my grandmother and my mother on a balcony and all the laundry behind them. That was laundry that they were doing hand washing and mending for other refugees. My mother was taking French lessons. She basically went to French school as to audit the class. And she went from the very last in the class, because when she arrived, she didn't speak French, to by the end of the school year, she was first in the class. So initially, the teacher was very happy that she was making such great progress in her class. But by the end of the class, when my mother was at the head of the class, the teacher was frustrated that this foreigner was doing better than the French students. She did not tell my mother that she needed to apply to get into the lycée, the French high school. My mother needed to take the entrance exam. So the teacher was, again, rather anti-Semitic and did not tell my mother to take the entrance exam for the next step. So my mother was not qualified to continue in high school. To tell you more about these pictures, the picture on the left side is a picture of my grandfather. That is the last picture we have of him. That was taken in Nice in 1939. When Germany invaded France, he was arrested as an enemy alien. Remember, he was German by citizenship. The French were fighting Germany, so the French arrested him as an enemy alien. After France fell very quickly, a few months later, he was released. But a few weeks later, he was rearrested, this time because he was Jewish. France was divided into two countries, essentially. Northern France was occupied by the Germans and was under direct German rule. Southern France, Vichy France, had a puppet government installed that did whatever the Germans told them to do. So Nice was in southern France under the puppet government, but the puppet government arrested both my uncle and my grandfather. Kurt was 17 years old when he was arrested, and they were both sent to a concentration camp called Gurs in France. Yes, France had concentration camps.
Yeah.
They were not death camps, but they were concentration camps. And that was the last time my mother saw her father. There's another picture of my mother over there on the balcony in Nice, holding a little kitten. So my mother was 12 years old when France fell. There we go. Sorry. Okay. After they were, my grandfather and my uncle were arrested and sent to the girls' concentration camp. My mother and her mother would try to send them food rations. They were able to write to each other. At one point, they received a postcard from her brother saying, Mordechai is coming to visit. Mordechai was his Hebrew name, Kurt's Hebrew name. They didn't understand what to make of this postcard. A few days later, he hid in a garbage truck and was able to escape the camp. So he was able to get back to Nice a few days after they received this postcard. The picture on the left is a picture of him a few days after he arrived in Nice, looking very gaunt and thin and worried, understandably. They were afraid that the police would come looking for him at home. And so he joined a group of foreign workers called prestataires. These were foreigners who were stuck in France, and they had voluntold, to do hard labor for the French government, for the Vichy government. You can see a picture of my uncle in a quarry breaking up rocks. I'm not quite sure what the point of that is, but they did various hard labor as prestataires. And this was in 1941. Eventually, Kurt and other Jews in the prestataires were also deported, this time to Auschwitz. The photo on the top right is the last photo we have of Kurt before he was deported to Auschwitz. He was 19 years old. This was August 1942. But before he was deported, he was able to save the rest of the family. it had become very, very difficult, virtually impossible for them to extend their residency permit in Nice. The government gave them shorter and shorter extensions to the residency permit and was very reluctant to do so. The prestataire was in a work camp in southern France near a city called Carcassonne. Carcassonne is a very old city, a medieval city in southern France. And Kurt was able to find a small farm village nearby and get a residency permit for his mother and sister. This farm village was called Montlore, and there's a picture of it on the right-hand side here. At the time, it was maybe a few hundred people, pretty small village. Now it's even smaller. So my mother and grandmother moved to this village of Montlore. This is a picture of my mother when she arrived, and the center picture is my mother a few months later. She was a farmhand. She got work as a laborer, working for the lord of the village, basically. This was very medieval, as a farm laborer. My grandmother got work as a cook for the chief of the village. Eventually, Kurt was able to live with them for a short time in this village before he was deported, when my mother was 15. And at that point, it became necessary for my mother to go into hiding. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. And so being the cook to the chief of the village gave my grandmother a little bit of protection. Plus, this was such a small farm village, she was able to fly under the radar screen for the most part. But my mother was not. That protection did not extend from my grandmother to my mother. So she needed to go into hiding. The underground reached out to her and gave her an opportunity to hide. So the CZM, the Jewish Scouts of France, was a Jewish underground. They were focused on saving children. My mother had a few advantages over many of the other Jewish refugees in the area. She spoke fluent French with no accent. Eventually, she also spoke fluent English with no accent. She even learned Italian during that 1 year with no accent. She was an amazing linguist. They gave her a false identity and they hid her in plain sight. Her false identity, her name was changed from Edith Mayer in French to Edith Mayer, Edith Sarah Mayer, which was a Nazi's name. They required that every Jewish woman have the middle name of Sarah. The underground changed it to Elise Mayer. The reason for that, you'll notice that Elise Mayer sounds very similar to Edith Mayer. If somebody marched into the room, classroom or whatever, and said, Edith Mayer, where are you? And you jumped. You could say, I thought my name is Elise Mayer. I'm sorry, I thought you were asking for me. They wanted to have a name that sounded similar to your real name. They were able to give her a false birth certificate, which is this document on the left-hand side. They had to find ration coupons every month, a false ID card, and they were able to find hiding places for her. Her story, her underground false identity story, was that her mother lived in Nice. Her father was a POW. She had no siblings. Her parents were non-practicing Catholics, which is very common in France. And she was hidden in over 7 locations in 1 year. She started off in a convent school. Then she went to a Jewish orphanage. And then she had to go to a hospital. Then she went to a Collège Moderne de Jeunes Filles, another girls' boarding school, a Florac camp, a camp over Christmas break when all the boarding schools were closed, another boarding school, a vocational high school, Centre de Jeunes Filles Déficientes. We'll talk a little bit about this. Obviously, there are not a lot of pictures of these hiding places, and I'm not going to go into detail about all of them, but I'll tell you a little bit about the first picture, the first hiding place. And this picture is really important. She got there in the last month of school. My mother is in that red circle on the left-hand bottom left row. She had no textbooks, no bedding, no sheets. The underground was busy finding hiding places. They didn't have time to make sure that you had the school supplies and bedding to look like you could blend in with the other kids. They were lucky to get you a ration coupons. She took very little with her. She only owned one skirt that had been made from her brother's old pants, 2 blouses, 1 sweater, a threadbare coat, and some underwear. And that was it in terms of clothing. And pretty much all other possessions as well. So this was a school picture of the class that was taken on one of the last days of school. And then after school was out, the nuns asked if she would like to stay and work in their day camp for the summer. And of course, she helped out in the summer day camp. And then school reconvened in the fall. One of the girls came back to the school and said, I showed this class picture to my cousin, who has a friend who lives in a town called Montlore. She says, you're not Elise Mayer. Your real name is Edith Mayer. Her cover was blown. And so she had to be out of there immediately. The very next day, they sent her away. They couldn't keep a kid whose cover was blown. The only place the underground could find to send her to in such short notice was an orphanage that was in the process of being disbanded because it was too dangerous at that point to keep a bunch of Jewish kids together. Unfortunately, the next day after arriving, my mother woke up with a sore throat. And by the following day, she had full-blown diphtheria. Every time when I was a kid and I was complaining about having to get shots and immunizations, she would say, oh, be glad that you don't have to get diphtheria. You can get a shot that keeps you from catching it, because she caught just about all these childhood diseases. So she was in the hospital for a month with diphtheria. No effective treatments, no antibiotics. All they had was horse serum that reduced the worst of the symptoms, but gave you terrible allergy, itching, hives everywhere. And still you were quite sick. When she started to get better from diphtheria, her roommate had scarlet fever in the hospital. She caught scarlet fever. So she was sick with scarlet fever for another month. Again, no antibiotics. Eventually she was able to pull through, but this was a low point of her time in hiding. She wrote a letter to her mother at that point saying, I want to give up. I want to come home. We're all going to die anyway. I want to die with you. And the underground was able to pass letters from person to person, eventually reaching the destination. So she passed this letter on to the underground. Well, after this, they were able to, when she was released from the hospital, she went to the Collège Moderne de Jeunes Filles. That was a boarding school for young girls in France. But then a few weeks later, it was Christmas break. Closed. What was the underground going to do with all these kids that had no home to go? All the French kids went home for 2 weeks. What were these kids going to do? So the underground rented an old army barracks on a mountain called Florac. And they brought all the kids there. They brought about 20 counselors and 80 children, mostly teenagers. My mother, again, is in the red circle, sitting on the ground and near the front. They had no resources, but they were able to get the kids enough food, which was very important. They taught the kids to dance a hora. They taught them Jewish songs. They did ball games. They wrote songs. They did hikes. They did a talent show. They did an Oneg Shabbat. For the first time, these kids could be who they were. They did not exchange their real names, but they could be themselves. And they didn't have to lie to the people around them about their identity. They did not exchange names or anything identifying. And my mother writes that in 2 weeks, they succeeded in boosting our morale while at the same time giving us a heavy dose of Judaism. They inspired us to keep going while continuing to hope for a better future. So towards the end of this period in Florac, the chief called my mother into where he was working, showed her the letter that she had written to her mother from the hospital. And he asked her, "Do you still want me to send this letter?" My mother tore up that letter and wrote another one because at that point, she no longer was ready to give up. She wanted to keep going. All right. So after leaving Florac, she went to another boarding school, no showers for 6 weeks, totally inadequate food. It was the worst of the hiding places she was at. After 6 weeks, they got her into a vocational high school, which was better. Good campus and adequate food for a few weeks. In fact, it was such a nice campus that the Germans came in one day and said, we like this school. We want it. You're out of here. The kids are out. We're taking over. We're moving in tomorrow. So they had to find homes for all these kids, again, overnight. People ask, why so many hiding places in 1 year? This is why. So where do you send? There were 2 or 3 kids in this hiding in this school. They sent them to a Centre de Jeunes Filles Déficientes. A literal translation from the French is Center for Young Deficient Girls. Pardon the French. Nowadays, we would call something like that a school for girls with cognitive challenges. So my mother was there for 2 weeks. And then the Germans decided they didn't want that vocational high school after all. So they were able to go back to the vocational high school. But by then you can see it was getting to be very difficult for the underground to be moving these kids around and constantly finding hiding places for all of them. So they decided at this point, they were going to try to smuggle kids into Switzerland. Switzerland was still accepting children 16 and under. They would not take adults, but they would take children. And so this map, this is a snapshot from Google Maps, actually, showing the route that they took. There was a group of 30 children, mostly teenagers and a 5-year-old. The plan was to get off at Viry and go north into Switzerland. The red line is a border between Switzerland and France. The green line is a train track. Now you'll notice that the other town at the end of the train track, Saint-Julien-en-Genevois, is much closer to the Swiss border. Because of that, it was heavily guarded because people were trying to cross into Switzerland from that train station. So instead, the plan was to get off the train at Viry and walk to Switzerland, walk due north. So the train pulls into Viry. The kids start to get off, 30 kids. It takes a few minutes. Now, if nothing else, the Nazis made the trains run on time. So when half the kids had gotten off the train kept on going to the next station. Half the kids were on the train, including my mother and the 5-year-old kid. So when the train got to Saint-Julien, they scrambled off the train and walked back along the train tracks. Remember I told you at the beginning that whenever my mother would encounter something that reminded her of her childhood, she would talk about it. And, like many parents, whenever my mother walked on railroad tracks for her entire life, this came to her. She remembered this trip. It's about a 4-mile walk along the train tracks between these 2 train stations. They had to carry the 5-year-old because he couldn't walk. When they got to Viry, fortunately, they found the rest of the group, which included all the adult leaders who had gotten off at Viry. Then they were able to walk to Switzerland, walk north. The guides that they had hired to lead the way got lost. So they walked in a giant circle. And finally, they were able to make their way across the border into Switzerland. One of their leaders is shown on this picture here. Her name is Marianne Cohn. She was born in Germany in 1922. Her family fled to Spain following the Nazi seizure of power. Then they fled to France to escape the Spanish Civil War. In France, they were deported to the girls' internment camp, the same camp that my grandfather and my uncle were at, because they were German nationals also. Somehow Marianne was able to get out of that camp and joined the Jewish resistance. And she was leading groups of 30 children or so illegally into Switzerland every couple of weeks, every week or so. My mother writes in her book, when they got to the border and Marianne stayed on the French side of the barbed wire, I asked her, "You're not going back to that hell, are you?" She didn't say anything, but nodded. Later, I learned that just 1 month after our crossing, she led a larger group of children to the border and was caught, tortured, and killed. She was barely 21 years old. Her resistance movement had organized a plan to free her from prison, but she refused because she was afraid that the Germans would have reprisals on the children that were imprisoned with her. So I want to honor Marianne Cohn and her sacrifice. So my mother survived the war in Switzerland, working. Her mother survived the war in that French farm village, and both her father and brother were killed in Auschwitz. After the war, she went back to France and was reunited with her mother. She completed 6 years of high school in a single year. When I was growing up, that just amazed me. I was struggling to complete 1 year of high school per year. She did 6. Eventually, she earned a master's degree at the University of Toulouse. Remember that when the war was over, she had a 5th grade education. She was 17 years old and had a 5th grade education. And she felt, in her words, she felt very stupid. It was extremely important to her to get an education and to learn about the world. She worked extremely hard to make that happen. She wasn't able to emigrate to the United States until 1954. The US finally gave her a visa, gave her mother a visa a year later. It took that long. So obviously she got married, she had 3 children. She had a career initially as a university professor. She taught French and German at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Then she became a certified financial planner and would say that she was teaching people financial management and finance skills. And finally, she retired to finish writing her book and become a public speaker. I really want to emphasize here that, as I said at the beginning, genocide starts with words. And if we don't say anything, we are complicit in this. Silence is complicity. Albert Einstein said that the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. Everybody can take a stand in the playground, in the grocery store, the bus driver, the bus conductor who looked the other way and sold them tickets to France knowing that they were illegal. Teachers who were kind to her, teachers who were not kind to her, classmates who shared their food or who did not share their food. Everybody can do something. It's important not to be a bystander in the face of injustice. A very common quote is, "All that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." And then I want to finish with tying this back to Michigan. My mother loved nature, and she did appreciate the volunteer work I do for Blue Heron Headwaters Conservancy. So in her honor, we are constructing a scenic overlook in her name. It will be a very fitting place to memorialize her. It's in Davisburg, Michigan, not too far from Detroit. And I hope that you can come this spring when the scenic overlook is finished and we're able to dedicate it. I also wanted to say that if you would like to buy her book, I had encouraged her to buy, well, she had done a lot of public speaking at the Holocaust Museum where she lived, and other bookstores and other places where she talked. And she was always running out of books. People wanted to buy her book, and she was always running out. So I encouraged her to buy 400 copies of her book, and I figured that would last her for about 3 months. Well, then COVID hit, and all speaking engagements were canceled. All book signings were canceled. And so I inherited a couple hundred copies of her book. And you can buy it on Amazon, but I would love to send you a copy that I have. If you're able to send me a check for $30, I will mail a copy of this to you. She also wrote a book of poems. This is only $10 if you want a book of her poetry as well. I would be happy to share that with you as well. Do you have any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Let's
So-
see if we can get your face back on.
Yeah, we might
Oh, I
want
need
to
to
stop
stop
sharing
sharing.
for just a second. I will
Yes.
put in the group chat, though, your address for people who might be interested in. I just was getting ready to do that. So I have a question for you. First of all, thank you so much, Emily. That was wonderful and just a lovely tribute to your mom. So my question is this. I come from a family of photographers. How on earth were those pictures saved that you have? What an amazing treasure to have those pictures from your Uncle Kurt and from your grandfather. It's amazing that those were able, and just of where your mother was. Like, it's just mind-boggling. How did you end up getting those images?
That's one of the unique aspects, I think, of my mother's story, because obviously when she went into hiding, she couldn't take any of that stuff with her. But remember, her mother was flying under the radar screen in this little tiny farm village. Her mother was able to keep those pictures and keep those papers. My mother even has her first grade report card. Very proud of all of the A's, straight A's in her first grade report card that her mother kept that. And so a lot of these papers are now at the Holocaust Museum, but we have copies, images of them in the book. So that's how it was unusual that she was able to do that.
Yeah, it's usually those bits of ephemera that just go into the ether and never to be seen again. So how amazing that you had those. That's
She has
wonderful.
very little from her time in hiding, obviously, because you couldn't keep any memorabilia when you were under a false identity. Even tracking, from school to school, you couldn't do that.
Mhm.
But from the period before the war or before she went into hiding, she has a reasonable amount of that.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. All right, I see Jeannie's unmuted. I think she has a question.
Yes, that was beautiful. It was poignant and sad and also very sweet. And your mother looks like someone that all of us would want to meet and talk with. She really had a lovely face and smiling in most of those pictures.
Oh, yeah.
As historians, I'm thinking that not only is silence complicity, but not learning about the Holocaust and what happened in these stories and not listening to this sort of thing is also a form of complicity. And each story is so different. We've all heard so many things. We're knowledgeable about much of this, but certainly each story is so unique, and this one really was too.
I totally agree with you. If learning history only makes you feel good about yourself and about the world, you're not really learning history. History
Absolutely.
is supposed to challenge you and to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, the potential, what people can do. It's supposed to empower you. It should make you feel uncomfortable at times because history is not a bed of roses. And if you're looking for a bed of roses, you're putting your head in the sand.
Right. It probably isn't authentic history if everything is beautiful.
Right.
But what a lovely way to remember her. I think that not only is that address for the books in the chat, but if any of you who are on this Zoom call are interested in attending this this ceremony, I guess, in the spring, I hope you'll let us know at JHSM and we can put the word out
Yes.
for those people who want to go. Can you tell us a little bit about the Blue Heron Conservancy and just, in so that we know a little bit about it?
Sure. I'm president of the board of directors, so I hope I can tell you a little bit about it. The Blue Heron Headwaters Conservancy protects land in the headwaters of the 4 rivers of this area. The Clint, Huron, Shiawassee, and Clinton rivers. Because the headwaters, the places where these rivers begin, have a lot in common with each other. There are lots of wetlands, which is where we get our drinking water. We purify our drinking water. Beautiful upland forests. We have 1,500 acres that we protect throughout this area, including over 60 different preserves. And many of them are open to the public and you can walk around in them. I encourage people to go to our website, blueheronheadwaters.org, to get directions for places where you can go for walks. One of the preserve where we are building this memorial for my mom actually protects a globally endangered butterfly called the Poweshiek skipperling butterfly. There are less than 100 of these butterflies left in the world, and half of them are at this nature preserve. Here, the other half are in Canada. Half of them are here in Springfield Township in this nature preserve. And so I love the idea that we will have a plaque honoring my mother here in Michigan in this nature preserve, overlooking the wetland where this globally endangered butterfly and other endangered species live. So I hope people can come and help us with the unveiling of this plaque.
We are
Great.
so excited to be partnering with you, Emily, on that project in the spring and help get the word out and, you know, be able to do something where we can see that legacy continue. I did go ahead and put the website in the chat for those of you, if you want to grab it, you're able to go there. And I know I'm looking forward to taking some of those. You just told me you did a nature hike not too long ago, Emily, to do a butterfly walk and show us about those beautiful things. So I'm looking forward to being able to go there and visit that area myself. And what a beautiful legacy for your mom to leave for us Michiganders to be able to have. You know, I know it's through you living here for you bigger 19, almost 20 years now in Michigan, but what a beautiful legacy for your mother to be so inspired when I'm sure she came to visit you like my mother comes to visit me, and that she would want to be able to have that legacy to continue. That is wonderful. That is wonderful.
I saw the picture of my mother with the Swiss mountains behind her. When I was growing up, she was always taking us on walks in the woods. She loved to go hiking. She loved the mountains. She loved nature. And I guess I inherited that from her. And so this scenic overlook, it's the closest we have in Michigan to a mountain, really matches something that she would have really liked. It does feel like a continuation. One of her favorite sayings was, make of your life a dream and then turn that vision into reality. And that seems like a fitting line to have at a scenic overlook in memory of her.
It's beautiful.
We,
A quote from one of her
we have a
favorite authors.
question here in the chat too. Alan Baum asks, what were the circumstances of your mother and grandmother after the war ended and before they came to the US?
Wow, that's a big question. They were destitute. When my mother got back to France, she wanted to go to school, but there was no opportunity for her to go to school. They needed to put food on the table. She ended up working in flea markets, in the fairs in France. They would sell used clothing and go from village market to village market, setting up at a new market every day. She would get up long before dawn. Her boss would pick her up. They would go to a flea market, set up, sell used clothing all day, get home, sleep, and repeat. It was backbreaking work. It was very long work, very long days, and it barely put food on the table. She did benefit from some Jewish charities that were able to provide, had cafeterias for Jewish children. So she was able to get some food from those places on occasion. All of France was in pretty bad shape. There was rationing throughout France. And my grandmother had a cousin in New York City who sent them care packages, clothing and food. That was very, very helpful. And eventually it was this cousin who was the sponsor for both my mother and grandmother to come to the United States. When she got the scholarship to do 6 years of schooling in one, she was required to finish. It was a 1-year scholarship, and she was required to graduate high school at the end of that scholarship. All she did that year was study and go to school. That was it.
It's amazing
Just-
she was able to do that.
She's very determined,
Indeed.
and she was desperate to get an education. She's always valued education all her life.
So many lessons in this story. We could talk about immigration issues and education and Jewish culture. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the memorial.
Well, thank you. I hope you
I
can
hope
come.
it's a day that can work out with our busy JHSM schedule in the spring.
I hope-
If there are any questions, any additional questions, you could either put them in the chat, or if you want to just jump in. Otherwise, we'll close the evening. Wait a moment here. Well, we thank you very much for sharing this beautiful and tragic story with us. And I do hope that some of us will have a chance to visit with you later.
I hope to be able to see you later. Yes, this
Okay.
spring. I will let you know when.
Good night,
Thank you
everybody.
so
and
much.
Stay
Thank you.
dry.
Good night, everyone. Be careful out there. The weather is supposed to be pretty icky tonight in some parts of Michigan. So thank you so much, Emily. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you.